The dust never settled in Copper Creek. It swirled around the wooden buildings like ghosts of the past, carrying whispers of broken dreams and abandoned hopes. The town itself was a testament to the harsh realities of frontier life, where fortunes could be made and lost with the changing of the seasons, where families could disappear into the vast wilderness and never be seen again. Main Street stretched like a scar across the prairie, lined with weathered storefronts that had seen too many dreams die and too many hopes buried in the unforgiving soil. In the autumn of 1887, when the cottonwoods turned gold and the wind carried the promise of a harsh winter that would test every soul in the territory, 3 children appeared at the edge of town like tumbleweeds blown in by fate. They emerged from the morning mist like apparitions, their small forms barely visible against the endless expanse of prairie grass that stretched to the horizon. The sight of them would later be burned into the memory of every person who witnessed their arrival, a reminder of how quickly life could strip away everything that mattered and leave only the essential truth of human endurance. The girl couldn't have been more than 12, though her eyes held the weight of someone who had lived a dozen lifetimes in the span of a few terrible weeks. Her dark hair was matted against her head, tangled with prairie grass and dust from countless miles of walking. Her dress, once perhaps blue or green, had faded to the color of prairie dirt, torn and mended with strips of fabric that told a story of desperate resourcefulness. She clutched the hands of 2 smaller children with a grip that spoke of absolute determination, her knuckles white with the effort of holding on to the only things in the world that still mattered to her. The boy she protected couldn't have been more than 8, his face gaunt with hunger but his eyes still holding a spark of the curiosity that belonged to childhood. His clothes hung loose on his thin frame, and his bare feet were wrapped in strips of cloth that had once been part of a shirt. Despite his obvious exhaustion, he stayed close to his sister, understanding even at his young age that she was the anchor that kept him tethered to safety in a world that had proven itself capable of infinite cruelty. The youngest was a girl who couldn't have seen more than 5 summers, her blonde hair so pale it was almost white, her blue eyes enormous in her small face. She carried a bundle of rags that might once have been a doll, clutching it to her chest as if it contained all the comfort left in the world. Her dress was too big, clearly altered from adult clothing, and her feet were wrapped in the same makeshift protection as her brother's. But it was the way she looked at her older sister, with absolute trust and devotion, that spoke to the bond that had carried them across impossible distances. Their faces were gaunt with hunger that went beyond missing a few meals, marked by the kind of deprivation that carved itself into bone and spirit. Their eyes were hollow not just with physical need, but with the particular emptiness that came from seeing too much death, too much loss, too much of the world's capacity for taking away everything that made life worth living. They moved with the careful, measured steps of people who had learned that every ounce of energy was precious, that survival might depend on the ability to keep walking long after the body begged to stop. When Sheriff Morrison approached them that cold morning, his breath forming clouds in the crisp air, the eldest girl pulled her siblings behind her like a mama bear protecting her cubs. The gesture was so automatic, so instinctive, that it spoke to months of serving as their sole protector, their guardian against a world that had already proven its willingness to destroy everything they loved. Her thin shoulders squared despite their obvious weakness, and her chin lifted with a defiance that was heartbreaking in its futility. Sheriff James Morrison was a man who had seen his share of tragedy in 20 years of keeping the peace in frontier towns. He had dealt with claim jumpers and cattle rustlers, with families destroyed by disease and drought, with children orphaned by violence and neglect. But something about these 3 touched him in a way that surprised him with its intensity. Perhaps it was the fierce protectiveness of the eldest girl, or the way the younger children trusted her so completely, or simply the fact that they had somehow managed to find their way to safety when so many others had perished along the trails that crisscrossed the territory. "What's your name, child?" the sheriff asked, his voice gentle despite his weathered appearance and the badge that marked him as a representative of authority. He had learned over the years that children who had been through trauma often needed careful handling, that the wrong word or gesture could send them fleeing back into the wilderness where they would almost certainly die. The girl's lips moved, and Morrison leaned forward, straining to hear. But no sound came, just the working of her mouth as if the words were trapped somewhere between her heart and her throat. She tried again, her face contorting with effort, her breath coming in short gasps as she struggled to give voice to something that seemed to have been lost along with everything else she had once possessed. The frustration in her eyes was painful to watch, the desperate need to communicate warring with some deeper wound that had stolen her ability to speak her own identity. The younger children pressed closer to her, sensing her distress, and she wrapped her thin arms around them protectively. The gesture was so natural, so practiced, that it spoke to countless nights of comfort given and received, of a bond forged in the crucible of shared suffering. Her hands smoothed their hair, her lips moved in what might have been wordless reassurances, and slowly the tension in their small bodies began to ease. "It's all right," Sheriff Morrison said, settling back on his heels to make himself less intimidating. "You don't have to tell me right now. Let's get you something to eat first, get you warmed up. Names can wait until you're ready." From across the dusty main street, Thomas Hartwell watched the scene unfold with growing interest and concern. He had been loading supplies into his wagon, preparing for the ride back to his ranch when the commotion started. The sight of Widow Patterson rushing from the general store with blankets, of Doc Henderson hurrying across the street with his medical bag, of half the town gathering to stare at the three newcomers, had drawn his attention like a magnet. Thomas was a man of 42 years, tall and lean like the fence posts that marked his property boundaries, his body shaped by decades of hard work under the unforgiving western sun. His hands were scarred from wrestling with barbed wire and ornery cattle, his face lined by wind and weather, his hair beginning to show the silver that came with middle age and hard-earned wisdom. He dressed simply but well, in clothes that spoke of success without ostentation, of a man who had built something substantial in a land that destroyed more dreams than it fulfilled. His ranch, the Double H, sprawled across 2,000 acres of some of the finest grazing land in the territory, a testament to 15 years of backbreaking work and careful planning. The house he had built sat on a rise overlooking the valley, solid and substantial, with glass windows that had been hauled across half the continent and a wraparound porch that caught the evening breeze. His cattle bore his brand. His horses were known throughout the territory for their quality, and his word was good in every bank and business establishment for 100 miles in any direction. But for all his success, for all the respect he commanded and the security he had built, Thomas Hartwell was a lonely man. His house, for all its size and quality, echoed with emptiness. The rooms that had been meant to ring with children's laughter stood silent. The nursery that Sarah had prepared with such hope remained unused, a shrine to dreams that had never come to fruition. The dining table where he ate his solitary meals had been built to seat 8, a testament to the family he and Sarah had planned to raise. Sarah, even 3 years after her death, the thought of his wife could still stop him in his tracks, could still fill him with a mixture of love and loss that threatened to overwhelm him. She had been the light of his life, the reason he had worked so hard to build something lasting, the dream that had sustained him through the early years when failure seemed more likely than success. Her death from pneumonia during the brutal winter of 1884 had left a hole in his life that nothing seemed able to fill. They had tried for children, Lord knew they had tried. Sarah had wanted them with a desperation that was painful to witness, had seen every failed pregnancy as a personal failure, had blamed herself for their inability to create the family they both craved. Thomas had watched her grow more withdrawn with each disappointment, had seen the light in her eyes dim a little more each time hope was followed by heartbreak. By the time she died, they had given up hope of ever having children of their own, had resigned themselves to a life that would end with them, leaving no legacy beyond the ranch that would eventually be sold to strangers. Something about the sight of those 3 lost souls tugged at something deep in Thomas's chest, something that had been dormant since Sarah's death. Perhaps it was the way the eldest girl protected the younger ones, or the obvious bond between them, or simply the fact that they had survived against impossible odds. Whatever it was, he found himself unable to look away, unable to dismiss them from his thoughts as just another tragedy in a land that produced them with depressing regularity. The children were taken to the church, where Mrs. Patterson, the preacher's wife, fussed over them with the kind of maternal attention that came naturally to women who had raised their own broods. She wrapped them in warm quilts that smelled of lavender and home, fed them soup that had been simmering on her stove, and spoke to them in the gentle, soothing tones that mothers used with frightened children. The church itself provided a sanctuary, a place of peace and safety that stood in stark contrast to the harsh world beyond its walls. Thomas found himself returning to town the next day, ostensibly to check on some business at the bank, but really drawn by something he couldn't quite name or understand. He caught glimpses of the children through the church windows, saw the eldest girl sitting rigidly upright while her siblings curled against her, saw the way she never seemed to fully relax even in the safety of the sanctuary. There was something about her that spoke to him, something that reminded him of a wild animal that had been too badly hurt to ever fully trust again. The day after that, he found another excuse to come to town, and then another. Each time, he managed to find a reason to walk past the church, to catch a glimpse of the three children who had captured his imagination and, if he was honest with himself, his heart. He told himself he was just being neighborly, just showing the kind of concern that was expected in a community where people looked after one another. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. It was old Doc Henderson who finally pieced together their story, or what little of it could be gleaned from the fragments of information the children could provide. Doc Henderson was a man in his 60s, grizzled and worn by decades of frontier medicine, but possessed of infinite patience and a gentle way with traumatized patients. He had served as the unofficial historian of the territory, the keeper of stories about the wagon trains that passed through, the families that settled and moved on, the countless small tragedies that marked the progress of civilization across the wilderness. The children, he determined, had been traveling with a wagon train bound for California, part of the endless stream of hopeful families seeking new lives in the promised land of the West. The train had been struck by cholera somewhere along the North Platte River, one of those swift and merciless outbreaks that could decimate a group of travelers in a matter of days. Cholera was the nightmare that haunted every wagon train, the invisible killer that could turn a group of healthy, optimistic families into a collection of graves scattered along the trail. She managed to get them away from the death and sickness. Doc Henderson explained to Thomas one evening as they sat on the church steps, watching the sun set over the prairie. Must have walked for weeks, maybe a month or more, living on whatever they could find or beg along the way. That girl's got sand, I'll give her that. Most adults wouldn't have had the strength or the determination to keep those young ones alive through what they've been through. Thomas nodded, his eyes finding the three children huddled together near the altar. Even in sleep, the eldest girl kept one arm draped protectively over her siblings, as if some part of her remained constantly vigilant against threats that might emerge from the darkness. It was heartbreaking and inspiring at the same time, this fierce devotion that had sustained them through unimaginable hardship. Any idea where they were heading? Family waiting for them somewhere? Thomas asked, though he already suspected the answer. Doc Henderson shook his head. The girl can't remember much beyond the sickness and the walking. Trauma does that sometimes. Blocks out everything except what's necessary for survival. The little ones, they're too young to remember much of anything useful. Near as I can tell, they're completely alone in the world. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Thomas knew what would happen next, had seen it before with other orphaned children who found their way to frontier towns. The local families would do what they could, would provide temporary shelter and food, but resources were limited and winter was coming. Soon there would be talk of the territorial orphanage in Denver, that grim institution where children were sent when there was nowhere else for them to go. Thomas had visited the orphanage once, years ago, when he and Sarah had briefly considered adoption. The memory still haunted him, the sight of dozens of children warehoused in overcrowded dormitories, their spirits broken by neglect and institutional indifference. The place had a reputation for turning out workers rather than family members, for breaking down children and rebuilding them as useful, but emotionally vacant adults. It was a place where children went to survive, not to thrive, and the thought of these three ending up there filled him with a cold dread. They'll want to send them to Denver, Doc Henderson said, as if reading Thomas's thoughts. Mrs. Patterson's already talking about it, says they can't stay at the church much longer. Winter's coming, and there's no family here willing or able to take on 3 children at once. That night, Thomas lay awake in his empty house, listening to the wind rattle the shutters and wondering what Sarah would have done in his place. She had always been the one with the warm heart, the one who brought home stray cats and injured birds, who never met a lost soul she didn't want to help. If she had been alive, Thomas knew, those children would already be sleeping in the rooms that had stood empty for so long. But Sarah was gone, had been gone for 3 long years, and Thomas was just a lonely man rattling around in a house that was too big for one person. What did he know about raising children? Especially children who had been through such trauma. What could he offer them beyond a roof over their heads and food on the table? Was that enough to justify disrupting their lives yet again, to risk adding to their pain if things didn't work out? But even as these doubts plagued him, Thomas found himself thinking about the way the eldest girl had protected her siblings, about the trust in the younger children's eyes when they looked at her, about the strength it must have taken to keep them alive through weeks of walking across hostile territory. There was something special about these children, something that spoke to qualities that went far beyond mere survival. They had managed to hold on to their humanity, their love for each other, even in the face of unimaginable loss. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline air that promised winter was not far away. Thomas rode into town with a sense of purpose that surprised him with its clarity. He had made his decision sometime during the long, sleepless night, had felt something settle into place in his chest like a puzzle piece finding its proper position. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt like he was moving toward something rather than simply moving away from grief. He found Sheriff Morrison at his office, feet up on his desk, reading a week-old newspaper and drinking coffee that looked strong enough to float a horseshoe. Morrison was a good man, steady and fair, who had earned the respect of the community through years of honest service. He had been a friend to Thomas during the dark days after Sarah's death, had understood without being told that sometimes a man needed to work through grief in his own way and his own time. "I want to take them," Thomas said without preamble, removing his hat and running his fingers through his graying hair. "The children. I want to take them home with me." Morrison looked up from his newspaper, raising an eyebrow in an expression that managed to convey both surprise and understanding. "The children. Tom, that's a mighty big responsibility for a man living alone. 3 children all at once, and one of them traumatized so bad she can't even tell us her name." "I've got room," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was proposing. "More room than I know what to do with. That house was built for a family, Jim. Maybe it's time it had one." Morrison set down his newspaper and leaned back in his chair, studying Thomas with the careful attention of a man who had learned to read people's motivations and intentions. "You sure about this? It's not like taking in a stray dog, Tom. Children need more than just food and shelter. They need patience, understanding, love. And these particular children, they're going to need a lot of healing." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, remembering the fierce protectiveness in the girl's eyes, the way she had wrapped her arms around her siblings, the trust that had somehow survived everything they had endured. "Sarah always wanted children, Jim. We tried for years, but it just wasn't meant to be. After she died, I thought that dream died with her. But seeing those children, seeing what they've survived, what they mean to each other, maybe this is her way of finally giving them to me. And if it doesn't work out, if they can't adjust to ranch life, or if you find out you're not cut out for being a father to 3 traumatized children, what then? Then I'll have given them a chance," Thomas said simply. "A chance to be part of a family instead of just wards of the state. A chance to heal in a place where they can be children instead of just survivors. That's got to be worth something, doesn't it?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I expect it is, but there's paperwork to be done, procedures to follow. And you'll need to talk to the children themselves, make sure they understand what you're offering and what it means." The paperwork, as it turned out, was surprisingly simple for such a life-changing decision. The territorial authorities were more than happy to place the children with a responsible adult who could provide for them, especially one with Thomas's reputation and financial stability. Within a week, the necessary documents had been prepared and signed, making Thomas Hartwell the legal guardian of 3 children, whose names he still didn't fully know. The conversation with the children themselves proved more challenging. Thomas found them in the church sanctuary, the eldest girl sitting stiffly upright while the younger ones dozed against her sides. She looked up when he entered, her eyes wary but not hostile, as if she had learned to reserve judgment until she understood what each new adult might want from them. "My name is Thomas Hartwell," he said, settling into a pew a respectful distance away. "I have a ranch not far from here, a big house with plenty of room for children. I was wondering if you and your brother and sister might like to come live with me." The girl's eyes narrowed slightly, and Thomas could almost see her mind working, trying to understand what he might want in return for such an offer. She had clearly learned that adults rarely did anything without expecting something back. That kindness often came with a price that wasn't immediately apparent. "What would you want us to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper but clear enough to be understood. It was the first time Thomas had heard her speak, and the sound was like music after the silence that had surrounded her for so long. "Be children," Thomas said simply. "Play, learn, grow up safe and loved. Help around the ranch when you're old enough and willing, but mostly just be part of a family. And if we don't want to stay, if we want to leave." Thomas was struck by the maturity of the question. By the way, this 12-year-old girl was already thinking like an adult who had learned that circumstances could change without warning. "Then you can leave. I won't force you to stay anywhere you don't want to be. But I hope you'll give it a chance, give us all a chance to be a family." The girl was quiet for a long time, her hand moving unconsciously to stroke her sister's hair. Finally, she nodded. "We'll try. But we stay together, all three of us. No matter what." "No matter what?" Thomas agreed, and felt something in his chest unclench for the first time in years. The ride back to the Double H was quiet, filled with the kind of nervous anticipation that comes with new beginnings. Thomas drove the wagon carefully, mindful of his precious cargo, while the three children sat in the back surrounded by their meager possessions and the blankets Mrs. Patterson had insisted they keep. The youngest girl, who had whispered that her name was Emma, clutched her bundle of rags and stared wide-eyed at the passing landscape. The boy, who had managed to tell Thomas his name was Billy, seemed fascinated by the horses pulling the wagon, his eyes following their movement with the intensity of someone discovering a new passion. But it was the eldest girl who drew Thomas's attention most often. She sat straight and alert, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon as if looking for threats or escape routes. There was something about her vigilance that spoke to experiences beyond her years, to a level of responsibility that no child should have to bear. She carried herself like someone who had learned that survival depended on constant attention, on never fully relaxing or letting down her guard. The Double H spread out before them like a testament to the power of persistence and hard work. The main house sat on a gentle rise, its white, painted walls and green shutters a welcoming sight against the golden backdrop of autumn grass. The barn and outbuildings were sturdy and well-maintained, speaking to prosperity without ostentation. Cattle dotted the pastures, fat and content, while horses grazed in the nearer fields. It was a picture of success and stability, the kind of place that represented everything the frontier promised to those brave enough to claim it. "This is your home now," Thomas told them as they stood on the front porch, the wooden boards solid beneath their feet, the rocking chairs inviting them to rest and be still. "All of yours, for as long as you want it to be." The house itself was a revelation to children who had spent weeks sleeping on the ground under the stars. There were real beds with soft mattresses and clean sheets, windows with glass that kept out the wind but let in the light, a kitchen with a cook stove that promised hot meals and warm rooms. Emma ran from room to room, her delight evident in every gesture, while Billy explored with the careful curiosity of someone who couldn't quite believe his good fortune. But the eldest girl moved through the house like someone conducting an inspection, noting the locations of doors and windows, the layout of rooms, the positions of furniture. Thomas watched her with growing understanding, recognizing the behavior of someone who had learned that survival might depend on knowing every possible exit, every potential hiding place, every advantage the environment might provide. That first night, Thomas lay in his bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of children in his house. There were soft whispers from the room where Emma and the eldest girl slept, the creak of Billy's bed as he tossed and turned in the small room across the hall, the gentle sounds of breathing and movement that spoke to life filling spaces that had been empty for too long. It was the most beautiful music Thomas had ever heard, a symphony of hope and possibility that filled his heart with something he had almost forgotten existed. The days that followed were filled with adjustments and small discoveries. Billy proved to be fascinated by the horses, spending hours by the coral fence watching them move and interact. his eyes bright with an interest that went beyond casual curiosity. Thomas began teaching him about horses, about their care and handling, and was amazed by how quickly the boy learned and how naturally he seemed to understand the animal's needs and moods. Emma attached herself to Thomas like a shadow, following him around the ranch with her bundle of rags tucked under her arm, chattering constantly about everything she saw and experienced. Her resilience was remarkable, her ability to find joy and wonder in small things a testament to the human spirit's capacity for renewal. She helped gather eggs, fed the chickens, and appointed herself supervisor of the ranch cats, a position she took with great seriousness. But it was the eldest girl who remained an enigma, helpful and polite but distant, as if she was afraid to truly settle in or believe that this good fortune might last. She worked harder than any child should have to, taking on responsibilities without being asked, as if she felt the need to earn her place through constant contribution. She helped with cooking and cleaning, mended clothes with surprising skill, and kept careful watch over her siblings with a devotion that was both touching and heartbreaking. Thomas began to understand that her inability to fully relax came from months of being solely responsible for keeping them alive, of making decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. She had been forced to become an adult while still a child, and learning to be a child again would take time and patience and more healing than anyone could rush. It was 2 weeks after their arrival that Thomas found her sitting on the porch steps at dawn, staring out at the horizon with tears streaming down her face. The sight of her distress hit him like a physical blow, and he settled beside her carefully, not wanting to startle her or invade her privacy but unable to ignore her obvious pain. "Bad dream?" he asked gently, his voice soft in the pre-dawn quiet. She shook her head, then nodded, then shrugged as if she didn't know how to explain the complex mixture of emotions that seemed to be tearing her apart. Thomas waited, having learned over the years that patience was often the key to understanding, that sometimes the most important conversations happened in the spaces between words. "I keep thinking they're going to come back," she finally whispered, her voice so soft he had to strain to hear it over the morning breeze. "Mama and Papa. I keep thinking if I watch the road long enough, if I'm vigilant enough, I'll see their wagon coming over that hill." The words hit Thomas like a sledgehammer to the chest, and he felt his heart break a little more for this child who had survived so much, but still carried the impossible hope that somehow the dead might return to life. It was the kind of magical thinking that children use to protect themselves from truths too painful to bear, and he knew that destroying it would be both necessary and cruel. "Honey, they're not coming back," he said as gently as he could manage. "You know that, don't you? Deep down, you know they're gone." She nodded, wiping her nose on her sleeve in a gesture that was heartbreakingly childlike despite everything she had endured. I know they're dead. I saw them die. But I can't stop hoping, can't stop watching. Is that foolish? Am I foolish for hoping?" "No," Thomas said firmly, his voice carrying all the conviction he could muster. "Hope isn't foolish. It's what keeps us going when everything else falls apart. It's what got you and Billy and Emma across all those miles to safety. Your parents, wherever they are now, they'd be proud of what you did. Getting your siblings to safety, taking care of them all this time, keeping them alive when anyone else would have given up. I don't even remember their real names," she said, her voice breaking with grief that went beyond tears. "Billy and Emma, those are just what I started calling them somewhere along the way. Their real names got lost somewhere along with everything else. And I can't remember mine either. Sometimes I think I'm Mary, sometimes I think I'm Catherine or Margaret or Grace, but nothing feels right anymore. It's like I lost myself along with everything else." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, thinking about identity and names, and the things that made a person who they were. He thought about Sarah, who had always believed that people were defined not by where they came from but by who they chose to become, not by the circumstances that shaped them but by how they chose to respond to those circumstances. "You know what I think?" he said finally. "I think names aren't about who you were. They're about who you are and who you're becoming. The person who walked across hundreds of miles to keep her siblings safe, who never gave up even when everything seemed hopeless, who still has room in her heart to worry about others, even after losing everything. That person deserves a name that reflects her strength and courage." She looked at him with those old, wise eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. eyes that held depths of experience that most adults never acquired. There was something in her gaze that spoke to recognition, to understanding, to the first tentative stirring of hope that had nothing to do with impossible dreams and everything to do with possible futures. "If you want," Thomas continued, his voice gentle but certain, "you could take my name. Hartwell. All three of you. That way you'd really be family, officially and legally and in every way that matters. You wouldn't just be children I'm taking care of, you'd be my children, with all the rights and protections and love that comes with that." The girl stared at him as if he had offered her the moon and stars, her eyes wide with disbelief and dawning hope. "You'd do that, really? You'd give us your name?" "I'd be honored to have you carry my name," Thomas said, meaning every word, "but only if you want to. And you can pick your first name too, whatever feels right to you. Whatever feels like the person you are now rather than the person you were before all this happened." She was quiet for so long that Thomas began to worry he had overstepped, had pushed too hard or moved too fast for someone who needed time to heal and adjust. But then, so softly he almost missed it, she said, "Grace, I think I'd like to be Grace." "Grace Hartwell," Thomas said, testing the name on his tongue and finding it perfect. "I like it. It suits you completely." The smile that spread across her face was like sunrise after the longest night, transforming her features from those of a traumatized child into those of a young woman discovering joy for the first time in months. It was a smile that spoke to healing, to hope, to the possibility of happiness after sorrow, and Thomas felt his own eyes fill with tears at the beauty of it. "Grace Hartwell," she repeated, as if trying the name on for size. "Billy Hartwell. Emma Hartwell. We're really going to be a family. We already are a family," Thomas said, reaching out to squeeze her hand. "The name just makes it official." The months that followed were a time of healing and growth that surprised Thomas with its intensity and speed. Grace threw herself into ranch life with a determination that amazed everyone who knew her, as if she were making up for lost time or proving her worth through constant activity. She learned to cook from Mrs. Patterson, who came out twice a week to help with domestic matters and who quickly became a combination of grandmother and confidante to all three children. Grace's natural intelligence and fierce determination made her an apt pupil in everything from bread making to bookkeeping. She absorbed knowledge like a sponge, asking questions that showed real understanding and making connections that impressed the adults around her. More importantly, she began to smile regularly, real smiles that reached her eyes and transformed her entire face, making her look like the child she should have been all along. She helped with the horses, proving to have a natural way with the animals that impressed even old Jake Murphy, Thomas's foreman, who had been working with horses for 40 years. Jake was a gruff, weathered man who didn't suffer fools gladly, but he took to Grace immediately, teaching her everything he knew about horse care and training with the patience of a grandfather sharing wisdom with a beloved grandchild. "That girl's got the touch," Jake told Thomas one evening as they watched Grace work with a particularly skittish mare. "Horses trust her, and that's something you can't teach. It's either there or it isn't, and she's got it in spades." Most importantly, Grace began to truly smile. Not just the polite expressions she had worn like a mask in those first weeks, but real, genuine smiles that lit up her entire face and spoke to healing that went beyond the physical. She laughed at Billy's jokes, played games with Emma, and gradually allowed herself to be a child again, to experience joy and wonder and the simple pleasure of being safe and loved. Billy, now Billy Hartwell in name as well as heart, discovered a talent for working with leather that surprised everyone, including himself. He spent hours in the barn learning to repair tack and make simple items, his small fingers proving surprisingly adept at the intricate work of braiding and stitching. More importantly, his fascination with horses grew into genuine skill, and Thomas began teaching him about breeding and training with the understanding that this might be the boy's calling in life. Emma, little Emma Hartwell, flourished under the attention and care like a flower finally receiving enough sunlight and water. She grew plump and rosy-cheeked, her laughter becoming a regular sound throughout the house and ranch yard. She appointed herself chief helper in all domestic activities, learning to churn butter and gather eggs and tend the vegetable garden with the seriousness of someone who understood the value of contributing to the family welfare. But it was Grace who continued to worry Thomas sometimes, even as she settled into their new life with apparent enthusiasm. She still woke some nights, checking on Billy and Emma to make sure they were safe, still carried herself with the alertness of someone who had learned that danger could appear without warning. She still scanned the horizon sometimes, though she no longer spoke of hoping to see her parents return, and Thomas understood that some wounds took longer to heal than others. The first real test of their new family bond came in the spring, when a fever swept through the territory like wildfire, striking down the healthy and the weak with equal viciousness. It was one of those mysterious illnesses that appeared suddenly and spread rapidly, leaving doctors helpless and families devastated. Emma fell ill first, her small body burning with temperature that made her delirious and weak, her usual bright chatter replaced by the frightening quiet of serious illness. Grace didn't leave her bedside for 3 days and nights, cooling her with wet cloths and holding her hand through the worst of the fever, singing half-remembered lullabies and whispering words of comfort and encouragement. Thomas tried to convince her to rest, to let Mrs. Patterson or one of the other ranch wives take a turn caring for the sick child, but Grace refused to be moved from her post. "I won't lose her," she said fiercely, her eyes red with exhaustion but blazing with determination. "I brought her this far, kept her safe this long. I won't lose her now." When Billy succumbed to the same fever 2 days later, Grace somehow found the strength to split her time between them, running from one bedside to the other, her face growing more gaunt with exhaustion and worry with each passing hour. She barely ate, refused